1847, Arizona Territory. When Sarah Bennett was dragged from the smoking ruins of her family's wagon at 16, everyone assumed she'd been condemned to a life of suffering. But 14 years later, when the U.S. cavalry finally rescued her, she did the unthinkable. She fought them, screamed in Apache, and begged to return to the man they called her captor. What could make a white woman choose a life with the savages over returning to civilization? And why was she willing to risk everything to get back to him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Sarah Bennett woke to the sound of cavalry bugles, she knew her world was about to shatter for the second time in her life. She lay perfectly still in the darkness of the wickiup, listening to the distant thunder of hooves, feeling the warmth of Dakota's body beside her. His breathing had already changed. He was awake too, every muscle tense, ready. "They've found us," she whispered in Apache, the language that had become more natural to her tongue than English. Dakota's hand found hers in the darkness. "We knew this day might come." Sarah pressed her face against his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of sage smoke and leather that clung to his skin. 14 years. 14 years since she had been taken from one life and given another. 14 years since a terrified 16-year-old girl had been pulled from a burning wagon and thrust into a world she couldn't understand. And now, in a cruel twist of fate, she was about to be saved from the only home she truly knew. But to understand why Sarah Bennett would fight against her own people, why she would risk everything to return to a man the cavalry called her captor, we must go back to the beginning. Back to 1847, when everything changed. The wagon train had left Independence, Missouri in April with 43 families full of hope and dreams of California gold. By September, as they crossed into Apache territory in what would later become Arizona, only 19 wagons remained. Disease, accidents, and the brutal desert had claimed the rest. Sarah's father, William Bennett, was a stubborn man with more ambition than sense. Despite warnings from their guide, despite pleas from other families to turn back or wait for military escort, he insisted they push forward. The shortcut through the mountains would save them 3 weeks, he argued. 3 weeks closer to the gold fields. 3 weeks closer to the fortune that would erase the shame of losing his farm back in Ohio. Sarah's mother, Elizabeth, said nothing. She had learned years ago that arguing with William only made things worse. She simply held her 2 younger children closer and prayed silently as the wagons rolled deeper into the Red Rock canyons. Sarah, at 16, was caught between childhood and womanhood. Between the obedient daughter her father demanded and the independent spirit her mother had tried to nurture in secret. She spent her days walking beside the wagon, her feet bleeding through worn boots, dreaming of a life that was anything other than the one she had. She dreamed of a place where women could speak their minds without being struck, where a girl's worth wasn't measured solely by her marriageability, where she could read books and ask questions and be something more than someone's property. These were dangerous thoughts in 1847, especially for a girl whose father had already accepted a proposal on her behalf from Harold Pritchard, a widower twice her age, who smelled of whiskey and had hands that lingered too long when he helped her down from the wagon. "You should be grateful," her father had told her when she dared to protest. "A man of property willing to take on a girl with no dowry. You could do far worse." Sarah suspected she could also do far better, but she had no say in the matter. When they reached California, she would become Mrs. Harold Pritchard, and her life would be over before it had truly begun. The attack came at dawn on September 23rd. Sarah would remember every detail of that morning for the rest of her life. The way the light painted the canyon walls gold and crimson, the smell of coffee boiling over the cook fire, the sound of her little brother Thomas laughing at something their mother said, the last moments of innocence before the world exploded into chaos. The Apache warriors seemed to materialize from the rocks themselves. One moment the canyon was empty, and the next it was filled with mounted warriors, their war cries echoing off the stone walls. The attack was swift and devastating. The wagon train's men, exhausted from the long journey and lulled by the peaceful morning, barely had time to reach their weapons. Sarah's father fell in the first volley of arrows. His rifle never fired. Her mother tried to shield Thomas and baby Grace, but a warrior on horseback swept down, and Sarah couldn't finish the memory. Even 14 years later, some images were too painful to revisit. She ran. Pure instinct sent her scrambling up the rocky canyon wall, her skirts tangling around her legs, her hands bleeding as she clawed at the stone. She could hear screaming behind her, women's screams, children's screams, the terrible sounds of violence and death. She almost made it to the top of the canyon wall. Her fingers were reaching for the rim when strong hands caught her ankle and pulled her down. Sarah fought like a wildcat, kicking and scratching and screaming until a sharp blow to her head sent darkness rushing in. Her last conscious thought was that death would be a mercy compared to what stories said the Apache did to captive women. But death didn't come. When Sarah woke, she was tied to a horse, her head pounding, her vision blurred. The canyon was far behind them, and the small band of warriors was moving swiftly through terrain so rugged she couldn't imagine how the horses kept their footing. She was the only captive, the only survivor, as far as she could tell. Terror gave way to a strange, detached numbness as they rode through the afternoon and into the evening. Sarah's mind couldn't process what had happened, couldn't accept that her entire family was gone, that her life as she knew it had ended in a matter of minutes. When they finally stopped at a small spring hidden among towering rock formations, Sarah was pulled from the horse and her bindings cut. She collapsed immediately, her legs unable to support her after hours tied in one position. An older woman with grey-streaked hair and a weathered face appeared with a water skin. She spoke in a language Sarah didn't understand, her tone neither kind nor cruel, simply matter-of-fact. When Sarah didn't respond, the woman lifted the water skin to her lips. Sarah drank greedily, not caring if it was poisoned. Part of her hoped it was. That first night, tied to a tree at the edge of the camp, Sarah waited for the horrors she had been taught to expect. She had heard the stories every white settler had. Stories of torture and violation, of captives treated worse than animals. But the horrors didn't come. The warriors ignored her completely, going about the business of making camp, tending their horses, sharing a meal of dried meat and some kind of flatbread. The old woman brought her food and water, then left her alone. When Sarah refused to eat, the woman shrugged and walked away. As darkness fell and exhaustion finally overcame terror, Sarah's mind began to work again. She was alive. That fact alone contradicted everything she had been taught about what happened to captives. Why? Why spare her when they had killed everyone else? The question would haunt her through the long night, but no answer came. The journey continued for 3 more days. Each day Sarah grew weaker, still refusing food, her body and spirit both shutting down. She rode in silence, no longer bothering to observe her surroundings or plan escape. What was the point? Her family was dead. Everything she had known was gone. Whether she lived or died seemed irrelevant. On the 4th day, they reached a larger camp, hidden in a box canyon that Sarah would never have believed could exist. Wickiups, dome-shaped shelters made of brush and hide, dotted the canyon floor. Women worked at cook fires, children played in the dust, and more warriors came and went on mysterious errands. Sarah was pulled from the horse and brought before an older man whose bearing and the deference shown to him by others marked him as a leader. He studied her with dark, unreadable eyes, then spoke to the warriors who had brought her. A brief discussion followed in that strange, fluid language. Then the old man gestured to the woman who had been caring for her, and Sarah was led away to one of the Wickiups. This is where it happens, Sarah thought with dull resignation. This is where the stories come true. But again, she was wrong. The woman, whose name Sarah would later learn was Nasha, brought her inside the Wickiup, gave her a bowl of some kind of stew, and through gestures made it clear she was expected to eat. When Sarah still refused, Nasha's weathered face hardened, and she spoke sharply, pointing at the bowl and then at Sarah's mouth. The message was clear: eat or face consequences. Sarah ate. The stew was actually good, flavored with herbs she didn't recognize, filled with meat and vegetables that gave her starving body sudden, almost painful life. She ate mechanically without tasting, but she ate. Nasha nodded approval, then showed Sarah a pile of animal hides in the corner. A bed. She was being given a place to sleep. The absurdity of the situation almost made Sarah laugh. She had been kidnapped, her entire family murdered, dragged across the desert to a place no white person probably knew existed, and now she was being tucked into bed like a child. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That night, lying on surprisingly comfortable hides, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the Apache camp, Sarah finally allowed herself to cry. She cried for her mother and Thomas and baby Grace. She cried for her father, despite everything. She cried for the life she would never have, for the future that had been stolen from her, but she also cried from confusion. Nothing about her captivity matched what she had been taught to expect. She hadn't been harmed. She'd been fed, given shelter, treated with a rough sort of practicality that suggested what? That she served some purpose? That she had value? The questions spun through her exhausted mind until finally, mercifully, sleep claimed her. When Sarah woke the next morning, her life as a captive and her transformation had truly begun. Nasha appeared at dawn with a bundle of clothing. She gestured for Sarah to remove her torn, filthy dress and put on the deerskin garments instead. When Sarah hesitated, Nasha simply began undressing her herself. As matter of fact, as if she were dealing with a recalcitrant child, the deerskin was soft against Sarah's skin, far more comfortable than the heavy wool dress she had been wearing. Nasha also provided moccasins to replace Sarah's destroyed boots, and tied her tangled blonde hair back with a strip of leather. Then the work began. Through gestures, example, and the occasional sharp word when Sarah was too slow or clumsy, Nasha taught her the tasks expected of Apache women: gathering wood, carrying water, preparing hides, grinding mesquite beans into flour. The work was endless and exhausting, and Sarah's soft hands, used to nothing more strenuous than needlework, quickly blistered and bled. But the physical pain was almost welcome. It gave her something to focus on besides her grief and confusion. The other women in the camp watched her with varying degrees of curiosity and suspicion. Some ignored her completely. Others made comments in Apache that Sarah couldn't understand, but suspected were not complimentary based on their tones and the laughter that followed. The children were fascinated by her blonde hair and pale skin, following her at a distance and whispering among themselves. One brave little girl even reached out to touch Sarah's hair one day, then ran away giggling when Sarah turned to look at her, slowly, painfully. Sarah began to understand that she had been adopted into the tribe, not as a guest or an equal, certainly. Her status was clearly that of the lowest member of the community. But she had been given a place, a role, a reason to exist. It wasn't mercy, Sarah came to realize. It was practicality. The Apache had lost members, women and children probably, and captives were sometimes taken to replace them. She was expected to work, to contribute, to earn her keep. If she proved useful, she would live. If not, Sarah decided to be useful. The weeks blurred together. Sarah's hands grew calloused, her body grew stronger, and the grief that had threatened to consume her slowly transformed into something else. Not acceptance exactly, but a grim determination to survive. And then, 2 months after her capture, everything changed again. His name was Takoda, and he was the most compelling person Sarah had ever seen. Takoda returned to camp on a cold November morning, leading a hunting party that brought with them 3 deer and stories of successful raids against Mexican settlements to the south. Sarah watched from where she knelt grinding mesquite beans. her hands moving automatically in the rhythmic motion Nasha had finally beaten into her. He was tall for an Apache, with broad shoulders and a lean, powerful build that spoke of years spent living hard in unforgiving country. His face was striking, sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes so dark they seemed black until the sunlight caught them and revealed depths of brown like aged oak. He wore his hair long, tied back with a strip of red cloth, and moved with a fluid grace that made every other man in camp seem clumsy by comparison. But it wasn't his appearance that caught Sarah's attention. It was the way others responded to him, the respect in how the elder warriors greeted him, the way younger men sought his opinion, the manner in which women smiled when he passed, and children ran to show him their accomplishments. This was someone who mattered. Dakota's gaze swept across the camp and stopped on her, the white captive with sun-darkened skin and calloused hands, kneeling in the dirt like any Apache woman. His expression remained neutral, but something flickered in those dark eyes. Curiosity, perhaps, or calculation. He spoke to Nasha, who had come to stand protectively beside Sarah. The old woman's response was long and apparently detailed, punctuated with gestures toward Sarah and the work she had been doing. Dakota listened intently, asked several questions, then nodded once and walked away toward the chief's wickiup. What did he ask about me? Sarah tried in her halting, badly accented Apache. Nasha looked surprised that Sarah had spoken. She rarely did, then almost smiled. He wanted to know if the white girl could be taught. I told him, "You learn quick when you want to avoid a beating." It was the longest conversation Sarah had yet had in Apache, and she felt an absurd flush of pride at understanding most of it. Over the following days, Sarah became aware of Dakota's presence in a way she couldn't quite explain. He didn't approach her directly, but she would catch him watching as she worked, his expression thoughtful. Once when she stumbled carrying water and nearly dropped the heavy clay jar, he was suddenly there, steadying her arm with a firm grip before she could fall. "Careful," he said in Apache. "Water is precious." His hand was warm on her arm, and his eyes met hers for a brief moment before he released her and walked away. Sarah stood frozen, her heart pounding for reasons she couldn't name. That evening, Nasha brought her news that made her stomach drop. "Dakota has asked the chief's permission to speak with you. He comes tomorrow." "Why?" Sarah's voice came out as barely a whisper. Nasha shrugged. "That is between you and him." But Sarah, she used the name for the first time, having only called her girl or white one before. "Dakota is a good man, a warrior of honor. Whatever he wants, listen carefully." Sarah barely slept that night. In the 2 months since her capture, she had existed in a strange limbo, alive but not living, present but not really there. She had learned to speak basic Apache, to perform the tasks expected of her, to survive, but she had built walls around herself, keeping everyone at a careful distance, never allowing herself to feel anything beyond the minimum necessary to function. Now, for reasons she didn't understand, those walls felt threatened. Dakota came the next morning as the sun was burning off the desert chill. He brought with him a rabbit he had caught, already cleaned and ready for cooking, and presented it to Nasha with the formal courtesy due an elder. Then he turned to Sarah. "Walk with me," he said in Apache. It wasn't quite a command, but it wasn't really a request either. Sarah glanced at Nasha, who nodded permission. She set aside the basket she had been weaving badly and stood, her legs trembling slightly. They walked in silence to the edge of camp, where a cluster of cottonwood trees provided shade and a small measure of privacy. Dakota settled onto a flat rock and gestured for Sarah to sit as well. She did, maintaining careful distance between them. "You have been with us 2 months, Dakota began, his Apache slow and clear enough for her to follow. "Nasha says you work hard and learn quickly." "This is good." Sarah said nothing, unsure what response was expected. "But you do not speak unless spoken to. You do not smile. You move through camp like a ghost, here but not here." His dark eyes studied her face. "Why?" The directness of the question startled her. "I don't understand." "Yes, you do." Dakota picked up a small stone and turned it over with his strong fingers. You are alive, but you are not living. You survive, but you do not exist. This is no way to be. Something hot and painful rose in Sarah's chest. My family is dead. Everything I knew is gone. I'm a prisoner in a place I don't understand, with people whose language I barely speak. How exactly should I be? The words came out sharper than she intended, and she immediately tensed, expecting punishment for the disrespect. But Dakota only nodded, as if she had confirmed something he suspected. Not a prisoner, he said quietly. A captive, yes, but there is a difference. A prisoner is kept against their will with no hope of becoming anything else. A captive can become one of the people if they choose. Choose. Sarah couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. I didn't choose any of this? No, Dakota agreed. You did not choose to be taken, just as the women and children your people killed did not choose to die, just as the Apache warriors killed by bluecoats did not choose their deaths. War is not about choice, it is about survival. Sarah looked away, not wanting to think about what he was saying, not wanting to acknowledge that there might be another perspective to the attack that had destroyed her life. But now, Dakota continued, now you have a choice. You can continue as you are, existing but not living, a burden to yourself and others. Or you can decide to be here, truly here, and perhaps find a life worth having. Why do you care? The question burst out before Sarah could stop it. Dakota was quiet for a long moment, still turning that stone over in his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before. Because I know what it is to lose everything. I know what it is to have your world destroyed and to wonder why you survived when others did not. And I know that there are two paths from that place, one that leads to a slow death of the spirit, and one that leads back to life. Sarah turned to look at him, really look at him, and saw something in his face that she recognized. Pain, loss, understanding that came from experience, not imagination. What happened to you? She asked quietly. My wife and son died 3 winters ago, a cholera brought by white traders. His voice remained steady, but Sarah could hear the cost of that steadiness. For a long time I wanted to die too. I took foolish risks in battle, seeking an honorable death, but the spirits would not take me. Eventually I understood why. Why? Because dying is easy. Living with purpose is hard, and the dead need us to live for them, to carry their memory forward and make meaning from their loss. The words struck Sarah like a physical blow. She felt tears burning her eyes, the first she had shed since that first night, and tried desperately to hold them back. Dakota pretended not to notice. I am not asking you to forget your family or to stop grieving for them. I am only asking you to consider that perhaps you were spared for a reason, that perhaps there is a life here, a purpose here, if you are brave enough to reach for it. I don't know how, Sarah whispered. Then I will teach you, Dakota said simply, if you are willing to learn. Sarah looked at this man who had lost as much as she had, who somehow still found the strength to live fully, to care about others, to offer kindness to a captive from the people who had brought cholera to his wife and child. Something shifted inside her chest, like ice beginning to crack. Why would you help me? She asked. Dakota stood and extended his hand to help her up. Because you remind me of myself when I needed help most. Because Nasha says you have a strong spirit beneath your grief. And because, he paused, and for the first time she saw uncertainty in his face. Because I think you could be happy here if you gave yourself permission. Sarah took his hand, the first time she had willingly touched anyone since her capture, and let him pull her to her feet. His grip was firm and warm, and he held her hand a moment longer than necessary before releasing it. What do I have to do? She asked. Live, Dakota said. Really live. Learn our language properly. Learn our ways not as a captive performing tasks, but as someone who wants to understand. Let yourself become part of the people instead of remaining separate from them. And you'll help me. Every day, he promised, if you wish it. Sarah looked back toward the camp, where Nasha was watching them with poorly concealed interest. Beyond her, women worked at various tasks. Children played. Warriors prepared for hunts and raids. This strange, foreign place that had been the site of her nightmare was also, she was beginning to realize, a living community with its own beauty and purpose. "I wish it," she said quietly. Takoda's smile transformed his face, revealing a warmth and joy that took her breath away. "Good, we start tomorrow. Be ready at dawn." True to his word, Takoda appeared the next morning before the sun had fully risen. He brought with him a bow and a quiver of arrows. "Today you learn to hunt," he announced. Sarah stared at him. "I can't hunt. I've never even held a bow." "Then today you hold one for the first time." He pressed the bow into her hands. "Come." What followed were weeks of patient instruction unlike anything Sarah had experienced. Takoda taught her to string the bow, to nock an arrow, to draw and aim and release. He showed her how to track animals by their signs, how to move silently through brush, how to read the land and predict where the game would be. He was demanding but never cruel, correcting her mistakes with matter-of-fact patience and celebrating her small successes with genuine pleasure. When she managed to hit a target from 20 paces for the first time, his whoop of approval made several people in camp look over in surprise. But he taught her more than hunting. He taught her Apache, real Apache, not just the basic commands and simple words she had learned from necessity. He taught her the stories of his people, their history and beliefs, the complex web of customs and expectations that governed their lives. He taught her about the plants of the desert, which could heal and which could kill. He taught her to read weather signs and navigate by stars. He showed her the sacred places in the canyon and explained why they mattered. And slowly, gradually, Sarah began to understand that this was not imprisonment. This was initiation. Our people, Takoda explained one afternoon as they sat in the shade after a successful hunt, believe that everything happens for a reason. You were brought to us when we had lost members to disease and war. You fill a space that was empty. You are meant to be here. "Your people killed my family," Sarah said, the old anger flaring. "How can that be meant to be?" "And your people have killed countless Apache families," Takoda replied without heat. "My wife and son are among them. Does that mean I should hate you?" Sarah had no answer to that. "Hate is easy," Takoda continued. "Understanding is hard, but understanding is how we survive. The Apache do not raid white settlements for pleasure or sport. We raid because our hunting grounds have been taken, our water sources claimed, our way of life threatened. We fight because the alternative is to slowly starve and disappear. So kidnapping me was justified?" Sarah demanded. "I did not say it was justified. I said it was understandable. There is a difference." Takoda looked at her directly. "What happened to you was terrible. What happened to your family was terrible. And what has happened to my people is also terrible. All of these things can be true at once." The complexity of what he was saying made Sarah's head hurt. She had been raised with simple certainties. White people were civilized, Indians were savages. The settlers were bringing progress and Christianity to a savage land. Resistance to that progress was evil that needed to be crushed. But living with the Apache, learning their language and customs, seeing their humanity up close, those certainties had begun to crumble. These were not monsters. They were people, complex, contradictory, capable of both violence and tenderness, just like any people. And Takoda was unlike anyone she had ever known. He was strong without being domineering, confident without being arrogant, deeply traditional while also being willing to question and adapt. He listened to her in a way her father never had, respected her thoughts, even when he disagreed with them, pushed her to grow while accepting who she was. Sarah found herself looking forward to their daily lessons with an eagerness that had nothing to do with learning skills and everything to do with being in his presence. She began to notice small things, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the rich sound of his laugh, the gentleness of his hands when he adjusted her grip on the bow. She noticed, too, the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't watching, a softness in his expression that made her heart race. 4 months after her capture, as winter settled into the canyon and snow dusted the high peaks. Sarah woke one morning and realized something that should have terrified her but didn't. She was happy, not despite being with the Apache, but because of it. Not in spite of Takoda's presence in her life, but because of it, and that changed everything. Spring came to the canyon in a riot of wildflowers and new growth, and with it came changes that Sarah could never have anticipated. She had been with the Apache for 8 months now, and the frightened, grief-stricken girl who had been dragged from a burning wagon seemed like a different person entirely. Sarah could now speak Apache fluently, moving between English and the native tongue with increasing ease. Her skin had darkened to a deep bronze from constant sun exposure, and her hands bore the calluses of hard work without complaint. She could track a deer through rocky terrain, prepare hides properly, weave baskets that didn't fall apart, and even grind mesquite flour without Nash's supervision. More importantly, she had found her place within the community. The women who had once regarded her with suspicion now included her in their conversations and their laughter. Children no longer ran from her, but sought her out to hear the strange stories she told of a world beyond the desert. Even the elder warriors nodded respectfully when she passed, and Takoda had become the center of her world in a way that both thrilled and terrified her. They spent nearly every day together now. He had taught her everything he promised and more, but somewhere along the way, the lessons had transformed into something deeper. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, their childhoods, their beliefs, their dreams for the future. They laughed together over small absurdities and sat in comfortable silence when words weren't needed. One warm April evening, as they sat watching the sunset paint the canyon walls in shades of amber and rose, Takoda reached over and took her hand. It was a simple gesture, but it felt momentous. "Sarah," he said, using her English name for the first time in months, "there is something I need to ask you." Her heart hammered against her ribs. "What is it?" "Among my people, when a man wishes to court a woman, he must first prove himself worthy through gifts and demonstrations of his ability to provide. But you are not Apache by birth, and our courtship customs may not be what you're accustomed to." He paused, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "I want to honor both your heritage and mine. So I ask you directly, may I court you? May I show you that my intentions are serious and my heart is true?" Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes, but these were tears of joy, not sorrow. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Takoda. They would be honored." His smile was radiant. Then he leaned forward and kissed her, gentle and reverent, as if she were something precious that might break. When they finally pulled apart, Sarah rested her forehead against his. "I never thought I could be happy again," she confessed. "I never thought I could feel this way about anyone, especially an Apache warrior." Takoda finished softly. "The enemy who destroyed your old life?" "You're not my enemy," Sarah said fiercely. "You saved my new life. You showed me how to live again." Over the following weeks, Takoda courted her with a combination of Apache tradition and tender innovation. He brought her gifts: beautifully tanned deerskin, turquoise beads from a distant trader, a knife with an intricately carved handle. He demonstrated his hunting prowess by bringing down an elk single-handedly. He composed songs in her honor that made the other women sigh with envy, but what Sarah treasured most were the quiet moments between them. The way he listened when she talked about her mother and siblings without judgment or impatience. The way he shared his own grief about his lost wife and son, trusting her with his vulnerability. The way they could communicate volumes with a single glance across the camp. The other Apache watched their courtship with mixed reactions. Most approved. Takoda was a respected warrior, and Sarah had proven herself a valuable member of the community. Nasha was positively gleeful, taking credit for Sarah's transformation at every opportunity. The chief himself gave his blessing, which carried significant weight. But not everyone was pleased. There was a woman named Kimi, beautiful and proud, who had expected to marry Takoda before cholera took his first wife. She had waited patiently through his mourning period, making her interest clear through gifts and attention. Now she watched Sarah with barely concealed hatred. "The white girl takes what should be mine," Kimi said loudly enough for Sarah to hear one afternoon. "First she takes our food and shelter. Now she takes our men." Sarah tried to ignore the barbs, but they stung nonetheless. She knew she would never truly be Apache in some people's eyes, no matter how well she adapted or how much she contributed. Then, in late May, everything changed. A scout returned to camp with disturbing news. A large party of white settlers had been spotted moving through territory to the east. Not the usual wagon trains trying to reach California, but something different. These settlers were staying, building permanent structures, claiming land along the river that had been Apache hunting grounds for generations. Worse, they were armed militia, not civilian families. They were prepared for conflict. The chief called a council, and for the first time, Sarah was invited to attend. As someone who understood both white and Apache cultures, her perspective might prove valuable. The council took place in the chief's large wickiup, with the senior warriors seated in a circle, and Sarah positioned slightly behind Takoda. She listened as scouts described what they had seen. Nearly 50 men, heavily armed, with women and children kept in a fortified central area. They were clearing land, diverting water, hunting aggressively, and showing no intention of moving on. "They are like the ones before," an old warrior named Cochetta said grimly. "The ones who come and never leave, who take and take until nothing remains for the people. We should drive them out now, before they grow stronger," argued a young warrior named Delgado. "Strike hard and fast, show them this land is not theirs to claim, and bring the bluecoats down on our heads." Another warrior countered. "Attack white settlers and the army comes looking for revenge." "We've seen this before." The debate continued, voices rising in anger and frustration. Sarah understood their dilemma. Do nothing and watch their hunting grounds disappear. Fight back and risk military retaliation that could destroy the entire band. Finally, the chief turned to her. "You understand the whites' ways. What would you counsel?" Every eye in the wickiup turned to Sarah. She felt the weight of the moment, knowing that what she said next could determine the fate of people she had come to love. "The settlers will not leave willingly," she said carefully, speaking in Apache. "Once whites build permanent structures, they consider the land theirs by right. They don't recognize Apache claims or understand shared use of territory. Then we must attack," Delgado insisted. "If you attack, you prove what they already believe, that Apache are savages who must be exterminated for the sake of progress." Sarah hated the words even as she spoke them. "The army will come, and they will not stop until they have either killed or captured every Apache in this region." "So we do nothing?" Cochetta demanded. "We surrender our land and our way of life." "I didn't say that." Sarah took a deep breath. "What if there was a way to make them leave without violence? What if we could convince them that staying here would be more costly than moving on?" The chief leaned forward with interest. "Explain." Sarah outlined a plan that combined psychological warfare with careful sabotage. Night raids that would steal supplies without harming people. Sounds in the darkness designed to terrify. Obstacles that would make daily life increasingly difficult and dangerous. The goal wasn't to kill, but to create an atmosphere of constant fear and frustration that would convince the settlers to abandon their claim. "Whites fear what they don't understand," Sarah explained. "Make them afraid of shadows and sounds. Make every night a torment. Make staying here feel like a death sentence, even if no one actually dies. Eventually they'll leave, and if they don't," Takoda asked quietly. Sarah met his eyes. "Then you'll have to make harder choices. But this way, you try the path with the least bloodshed first." The council debated her proposal for another hour before the chief made his decision. They would try Sarah's approach for one moon cycle. If the settlers showed no signs of leaving, they would reconsider more aggressive action. As the council dispersed, Takoda pulled Sarah aside. His expression was troubled. "That plan of yours, it puts you at great risk," he said. "What do you mean?" "You speak English. You understand their fears and superstitions. You would be most effective at creating the psychological terror you described. He cupped her face in his hands. But if they catch you, if they recognize you as a white captive, they'll try to rescue me, Sarah finished. The thought made her stomach clench with anxiety. I know. Then you won't participate in the raids, Dakota said firmly. Sarah pulled back. That's not your decision to make. Sarah, no. She spoke firmly but not angrily. I propose this plan. I won't ask others to take risks I'm not willing to take myself. Besides, you need me. I know how whites think, how they react. I can help make this work. Dakota looked like he wanted to argue further, but something in her expression stopped him. Instead, he pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. You are the bravest person I know, he murmured. And it terrifies me. The raids began 3 nights later. Sarah joined a small party of warriors, Dakota, Delgado, and 2 others, who moved silently through the darkness toward the settler camp. They had painted their faces and bodies, and Sarah had done the same, the unfamiliar weight of the paint somehow making her feel both more visible and more protected. They approached the settlement from downwind, moving with the patient stealth that Dakota had taught Sarah during their hunting lessons. The settlers had posted guards, but they were amateurs, farmers playing with soldiers, more concerned with staying awake than actually watching for threats. Sarah's role was specific. While the warriors disabled the settlers' well by dropping debris into it and scattered the horses from their makeshift corral, she moved close to the largest structure and began to speak. She used English, but made her voice strange and otherworldly, sometimes whispering, sometimes wailing. She spoke fragments of prayers and curses her mother had taught her, mixed with nonsense words that sounded ancient and terrible. She scratched at walls and rattled shutters. She created the sounds of a vengeful spirit that wanted these intruders gone. Inside the structure, she heard frightened voices, women crying, men shouting bravado to mask their fear, children whimpering. For just a moment, Sarah remembered being that frightened child, huddled with her own mother while danger circled outside. The memory made her hesitate. Then she thought of what these settlers represented, the wave of expansion that would eventually destroy everything the Apache had built, that would condemn people like Dakota to reservation life or death. She thought of her own happiness, the life she had found here, and how fragile it all was. She continued her haunting. By the time the raiding party withdrew into the darkness, the settler camp was in chaos. Animals scattered, water source contaminated, and the psychological seed of terror firmly planted. They had accomplished everything without spilling a single drop of blood. You were magnificent, Dakota told Sarah as they made their way back through the moonlit desert. The admiration in his voice was clear, but Sarah felt unsettled. She had just terrorized people who reminded her of her own family. People who were probably fleeing hardship in the East, seeking a better life, just as her parents had been. People who didn't understand they were building on someone else's homeland. Do you think it will work? She asked. I think we have planted fear, Dakota replied. Whether it grows into something that drives them away, time will tell. The raids continued over the following weeks, each one more elaborate than the last. The warriors stole tools, spoiled supplies, and created increasingly disturbing manifestations. Sarah became bolder in her role, sometimes appearing as a ghostly figure in white deerskin, sometimes speaking in tongues that combined Apache, English, and pure invention. The settlers grew more paranoid with each incident. Arguments broke out about whether to stay or leave. Some families packed up and departed within 2 weeks. Others dug in stubbornly, determined not to be driven away by superstitious nonsense. But then Sarah saw something during a scouting mission that made her blood run cold. Among the remaining settlers was a man she recognized, Captain Edmund Forrester, a career cavalry officer who had been assigned to escort wagon trains through Apache territory. He had been at Fort Union when Sarah's wagon train departed, and he had spoken to her father about the route they planned to take. He would recognize her if he got close enough. Worse, Forrester wasn't there as a settler. Based on the deference shown to him by the others and the way he was organizing defensive positions, he had been brought in as military protection, which meant the army already knew about Apache activity in the area, which meant the situation was about to escalate far beyond cattle, rustling and psychological games. Sarah reported this to the council that very night, her voice urgent. Captain Forrester is experienced in Indian fighting. He won't be frightened away by ghost stories. And his presence means the army is taking these settlements seriously. They're prepared to defend them with force. The chief's expression darkened. Then our time grows short. There's more, Sarah said reluctantly. Forrester knew my father. If he sees me, he'll recognize me. And if he realizes I'm alive and living with the Apache by choice. She didn't need to finish the sentence. Then you cannot participate in further raids, the chief said firmly. This time, even Sarah couldn't argue. But the danger wasn't just to Sarah. Forrester's presence changed everything. The campaign of harassment that had been working so well was about to bring down exactly the kind of military attention they had been trying to avoid. That night, lying beside Takoda under the stars, Sarah voiced the fear that had been growing in her heart. "This is the beginning of the end, isn't it?" she whispered. "Even if we drive these particular settlers away, more will come. And eventually the army will come in force, and everything we have here will be destroyed." Takoda was silent for a long moment, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "Perhaps," he finally admitted. "The tide of white expansion cannot be stopped by one band of Apache, no matter how clever our tactics. But Sarah, we can survive. If we're smart and strong and willing to adapt, we can survive. How? By being willing to change when we must. By choosing our battles carefully. By building bridges where we can, and fighting only when we have no choice." He turned to face her in the darkness. "By being like you, someone who can live in both worlds and understand both peoples." Sarah wanted to believe him, but she had a terrible feeling that the world was changing too fast, and that the peaceful life they had built together was far more fragile than she had allowed herself to believe. The real test, she knew, was coming, and it would arrive sooner than any of them expected. The summer of 1848 brought heat that shimmered off the canyon walls and tensions that crackled like lightning before a storm. Captain Forrester had not only stayed with the settlers, he had sent for reinforcements. Within a month, a detachment of 20 cavalry soldiers established a temporary post near the settlement, turning what had been an isolated civilian encampment into a militarized stronghold. The Apache raids stopped. They had no choice. Attacking civilians was one thing. Engaging U.S. cavalry was an act of war that would bring devastating consequences, but stopping the raids didn't stop the soldiers from hunting them. Forrester organized aggressive patrols that ranged deeper into Apache territory than any military force had dared before. He was methodical and patient, mapping water sources, identifying trails, and slowly tightening a noose around the hidden canyon that had been safe for so long. "He's too good," Takoda said grimly after yet another close call with a patrol. "He thinks like we do, anticipates our movements. It's only a matter of time before he finds the main camp." Sarah's heart clenched with fear, not just for herself, but for everyone she had come to love. Nasha, who had become like a mother to her. The children who followed her around begging for stories. The warriors who had accepted her as one of their own. And Takoda, especially Takoda. They had married in a quiet Apache ceremony 2 months earlier, binding their lives together before the entire band. Sarah wore deerskin decorated with turquoise and silver, and Takoda had presented her with a magnificent horse as proof of his ability to provide. When he spoke his vows in both Apache and halting English, promising to honor her always, Sarah had cried tears of pure joy. She was no longer Sarah Bennett, the terrified captive. She was Sarah Takoda's wife, a member of the band, someone with purpose and belonging. But that belonging was now threatened by the very people who shared her heritage. One scorching afternoon in July, as Sarah worked with the other women preparing prickly pear fruit, Nasha pulled her aside with unusual urgency. There is talk among the warriors, the old woman said quietly. Dangerous talk? What kind of talk? Some say you are a spy, that you told the bluecoats where to find us, that this Forrester came because you led him here. Nasha's weathered face was creased with worry. I do not believe this, and Takoda certainly does not. But Delgado and others, they remember you are white, and they wonder where your true loyalty lies. Sarah felt as if she'd been struck. That's insane. I would never. I know, child. But fear makes people see enemies everywhere. And right now we are all very afraid. The accusation, however unfounded, poisoned something essential. Sarah noticed the suspicious glances, the conversations that stopped when she approached, the way some warriors no longer met her eyes. Even Kimmy, who had been forced to accept Sarah's marriage to Takoda, seized the opportunity to spread doubt. Convenient, is it not? Sarah overheard Kimmy saying to a group of women, "The white soldiers come, and somehow they know exactly where to look. And the white girl who supposedly loves us so much, she's the only one who could have told them." Sarah wanted to defend herself, to shout her innocence, but she knew that would only make her look more guilty. Instead, she continued her work, kept her head high, and trusted that those who truly knew her would recognize the accusations for the poison they were. Takoda was furious when he heard the rumors. He confronted Delgado directly in front of the entire camp. "You dare question my wife's loyalty?" Takoda's voice was dangerously quiet. "Sarah has proven herself 100 times over. She has worked beside us, fought beside us, become one of us in every way that matters. Your suspicions dishonor her and dishonor me. She is still white," Delgado shot back. "Blood calls to blood. When the time comes to choose, she will choose her own people." "I am her people," Takoda said flatly. "She has made that choice already." But Sarah could see the doubt in other faces, the uncertainty, even among those who had been friendly before. The presence of the cavalry had created a pressure that was cracking the community apart, and she had become the most visible fault line. That night, lying in Takoda's arms, in their wiki-up, Sarah voiced the thought that had been tormenting her. "Maybe I should leave," she whispered. "Go to the soldiers. Tell them I was a captive who escaped. Remove myself as a source of division." Takoda's arms tightened around her, almost painfully. "No, but if my presence is causing—" "No," he repeated more forcefully. "Sarah, you are my wife. You are part of this band. What is happening is not your fault. It is the fault of Forrester and the soldiers who push into our territory. Do not let fear and suspicion drive you from your home. But what if they're right?" The words burst out before Sarah could stop them. What if, when it comes to actual conflict, I can't stand against my own people? What if I'm not as Apache as I believe? Takoda shifted so he could look directly into her eyes. "Do you love me?" "More than anything," Sarah said without hesitation. "Do you want to be here with me, with the band?" "Yes." "Then that is all that matters. Identity is not about blood, Sarah. It is about choice. You have chosen us, and we have chosen you. Let that be enough." Sarah wanted to believe him. But doubt, once planted, was difficult to uproot. The crisis came 3 weeks later. A hunting party led by Takoda encountered a cavalry patrol in a narrow canyon. Both groups were surprised, weapons were drawn, and in the tense standoff that followed, a young soldier, barely more than a boy, panicked and fired. The shot missed, but it triggered chaos. The Apache warriors returned fire, and in the brief but brutal exchange that followed, 2 soldiers fell and 1 Apache warrior was gravely wounded. The cavalry retreated, carrying their casualties, and the hunting party raced back to camp with their injured companion and the terrible knowledge that the situation had just escalated beyond control. "They will call this an ambush," the chief said grimly as they gathered in the emergency council. "They will say we attacked without provocation. Forrester will use this as justification to hunt us down." "It was the soldier who fired first," Takoda protested. "We were defending ourselves." "The bluecoats do not care about truth. They care about excuses." The chief turned to Sarah with an expression that made her stomach drop. "You know Forrester. You know how he thinks. Will he come for us now?" Sarah closed her eyes. thinking about the career officer she had met briefly at Fort Union. Forrester was ambitious, methodical, and absolutely convinced of the righteousness of expanding American civilization. 2 dead soldiers would give him exactly the excuse he needed to launch a full-scale campaign. "Yes," she said quietly. "He'll come, and he'll bring every available man. He'll want to make an example of this band, to show other Apache what happens when soldiers are killed. How long do we have?" Sarah calculated distances and logistics. A week, maybe less if he can rally reinforcements quickly. The debate that followed was heated and desperate. Some argued for immediate relocation to another hidden canyon they knew far to the north. Others wanted to dig in and fight, to make the soldiers pay dearly for every inch of Apache land. A few voices even suggested splitting the band, sending the women and children away while the warriors remained to delay pursuit. Finally, the chief made his decision. "We move north to the Winter Canyon. Prepare everything. We leave before dawn." The camp erupted into organized chaos as everyone began packing for the forced relocation. It would be a grueling journey, nearly 100 miles through brutal desert terrain, with children, elders, and all their possessions. But staying meant certain death. Sarah worked alongside the other women, her hands moving automatically through familiar tasks while her mind raced. Moving would buy time, but it wouldn't solve the fundamental problem. Forrester would just keep hunting them. The cycle of conflict would continue until one side or the other was destroyed, unless there was another way. The idea came to her fully formed, audacious and terrifying. She could go to Forrester, not as an escaped captive, but as a mediator. She could explain what really happened in that canyon. She could plead for a peaceful resolution, argue that the Apache were reacting to encroachment on their territory, not initiating aggression. She could use her unique position, white by birth, Apache by choice, to build a bridge between 2 worlds on the brink of war. The idea was probably naive and almost certainly doomed to failure. But wasn't it worth trying? Wasn't anything worth trying if it meant preventing the slaughter she knew was coming? Sarah didn't tell anyone about her plan, not even to Coda. She knew he would forbid it, would argue it was too dangerous, that Forrester might simply arrest her or worse. So she waited until deep into the night, when exhaustion had finally driven Coda into restless sleep, and she slipped from their wickiup. She took nothing but the clothes on her back and the turquoise necklace Coda had given her as a wedding gift. She touched it once, drawing strength from the physical reminder of his love, and then she began the long walk toward the cavalry camp. She moved through the darkness with all the skills Coda had taught her, silent and sure-footed despite the treacherous terrain. As the miles fell away behind her and the sky began to lighten with approaching dawn, Sarah rehearsed what she would say to Forrester, how she would explain her situation, her choices, her hopes for peace. But when she crested the final ridge overlooking the cavalry camp, her careful plans disintegrated. The camp was already mobilized. Soldiers were mounted and formed up, supply wagons loaded, scouts ranging ahead. They were preparing to move out, not in a week, but now. And the force was larger than Sarah had anticipated, nearly 60 men with artillery support. This wasn't a patrol or even a punitive expedition. This was an army prepared for extermination. Sarah stood frozen on the ridge, watching the martial precision below, and realized the terrible magnitude of her mistake. Even if she could convince Forrester to listen, and that was far from certain, it was already too late. The machinery of war had been set in motion, and nothing she could say would stop it now. She had to get back to warn the camp. They needed more time to evacuate, needed to know how large a force was coming. But as Sarah turned to retrace her steps, she heard the distinctive sound of a rifle being cocked directly behind her. "Don't move," a voice said in English. "Hands where I can see them." Sarah's heart plummeted as she slowly raised her hands and turned to face a young cavalry scout, his rifle trained steadily on her chest. Behind him, 2 more soldiers emerged from concealment. "Well, well," the scout said, taking in her Apache clothing and sun-darkened skin. "What do we have here? An Indian woman? Or—" His eyes narrowed as he studied her face more carefully in the growing light. Wait, you're white. What the hell are you doing dressed like a savage? Sarah's mind raced, calculating options. She could claim to be an escaped captive, but that would mean abandoning the Apache forever and betraying everything she believed in. She could refuse to speak, but her obvious comprehension of English had already given her away. She could try to run, but she'd never make it 10 feet before they shot her. "I need to speak to Captain Forrester," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "It's urgent." The soldiers exchanged glances. "Ma'am, are you a captive? Did the Apache take you?" "It's complicated," Sarah said. "Please, I need to speak to the captain. Lives depend on it." Whether they believed her or simply found her too intriguing to shoot, the soldiers escorted her down to the camp. As they walked through the rows of mounted cavalry, Sarah felt dozens of eyes on her, some curious, some suspicious, all judging the white woman in Apache dress. Then she saw Forrester emerging from the command tent, and her last hope of controlling this situation evaporated. Recognition flashed across his face immediately, followed by shock and something that looked almost like triumph. "Sarah Bennett," he said slowly, as if testing the name. "Thomas Bennett's daughter. We thought you were dead. The entire wagon train massacred." He broke off, his eyes taking in her Apache clothing, her confident bearing, the obvious fact that she had not been held prisoner in any conventional sense. "How long have you been with them?" 14 months, Sarah said, lifting her chin defiantly. "Captain Forrester, I need to talk to you about 14 months, Forrester interrupted, his voice hardening. "Living with the savages who murdered your family. Wearing their clothes, speaking their language." His expression shifted from shock to disgust. "My God, you've become one of them. Captain, if you'll just listen." "Sergeant," Forrester called out, "place this woman under protective custody. She's clearly been subjected to severe psychological trauma and needs medical evaluation." "No," Sarah protested, as soldiers moved to take her arms. "You don't understand. I came here to prevent bloodshed, to explain what really happened in that canyon." "What really happened," Forrester said coldly, "is that Apache savages ambushed and murdered 2 American soldiers. And now I find that they've been holding a white woman captive, no doubt subjecting her to unspeakable horrors. This only confirms the righteousness of our mission. I'm not a captive," Sarah shouted as the soldiers dragged her toward a supply wagon. "I chose to be with them. They're my family now. Forrester, please, if you attack that camp, you'll be killing innocent women and children." "Secure her in the wagon," Forrester ordered, his face set like stone. "We'll deal with her rehabilitation after we've dealt with her captors." As Sarah was forced into the wagon and her hands tied, she felt despair wash over her. She had tried to save both worlds and had instead betrayed the only one that mattered. The Apache camp would have no warning of the size of the force coming for them. They would be in the middle of evacuation, vulnerable and unprepared. And Takoda would wake to find her gone, would probably think she had abandoned him, that all the doubters had been right about where her true loyalty lay. The wagon lurched into motion as the cavalry column began its march. Sarah pressed her face against the wooden slats, watching the desert landscape roll past, and felt tears stream down her face for the first time since she had learned to be Apache. She had lost everything in the space of a single morning, and the people she loved had no idea what was coming for them. The cavalry reached the Apache camp at midday to find it abandoned. Sarah, locked in the supply wagon, heard the soldiers' frustrated shouts as they discovered the empty wickiups, the cold fire pits, the signs of hasty evacuation. The Apache had left before dawn. Whether because of her absence or simply good timing, Sarah would never know. But the camp was empty, and Forrester's carefully planned surprise attack had caught nothing but air. "Find their trail," Forrester ordered his scouts. "They can't have gotten far, not with women and children. We'll run them down." Sarah closed her eyes in relief. At least they had escaped the immediate danger. But her relief was short-lived as reality set in. The Apache were traveling with their entire camp, elders who couldn't move quickly, children who needed to be carried, possessions that slowed their pace. The cavalry was mounted and unencumbered. It was only a matter of time before they were overtaken, and when that happened, The slaughter would be devastating. For 3 days, Sarah remained a prisoner in the wagon as the cavalry pursued the fleeing Apache across the brutal desert landscape. She was given water and hardtack, but no one would speak to her beyond the bare minimum. The soldiers regarded her with a mixture of pity and disgust, a white woman who had somehow been corrupted by her captors, who needed to be saved from herself. On the 4th day, they brought her before Forrester in his command tent. The captain studied her with clinical detachment, as if she were a specimen to be analyzed rather than a person. "Miss Bennett, I've been considering your situation. The Army has protocols for rescued captives, particularly those who have been held for extended periods and may have developed—" He paused delicately. "In misguided attachments to their captors." "They're not my captors," Sarah said through gritted teeth. "How many times do I have to tell you? You've been subjected to months of psychological manipulation and likely physical abuse," Forrester continued, as if she hadn't spoken. "It's well documented that captives sometimes develop sympathetic feelings toward their abductors as a survival mechanism. Given time and proper rehabilitation, you'll come to understand that these feelings are not real." Sarah wanted to scream. Instead, she forced herself to speak calmly, rationally. "Captain Forrester, I am not suffering from any delusion. I'm a married woman. My husband is Dakota, a warrior of the band you're pursuing. I chose to marry him. I chose this life." Forrester's expression hardened. "You married a savage." "I married a man who showed me more respect and kindness than any white man ever did," Sarah shot back. "A man who listened to me, valued my thoughts, encouraged my strength instead of trying to diminish it. Yes, Captain, I married him and I love him, and if you attack his people, you attack my people. Then you are a traitor to your race," Forrester said coldly. "And I should treat you as such." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Sarah felt ice spread through her veins as she understood how precarious her situation truly was. Forrester could claim she had aided the enemy, collaborated with hostiles. He could have her court-martialed or simply shot as a turncoat, but Forrester didn't give that order. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and studied her with calculating eyes. "However, I'm not an unreasonable man. I understand you've been through a terrible ordeal, regardless of what you currently believe about it. So I'm prepared to offer you a choice." Sarah waited, knowing that whatever came next would be a trap. "Help us find the Apache camp," Forrester said. "You know how they think, where they might go, how they travel. Guide us to them, and I give you my word that when we engage, I'll offer terms of surrender. No massacre, just a clean military operation to relocate them to the reservation where they belong. You'll be facilitating a peaceful transition, saving lives on both sides, and if I refuse, then you remain a prisoner while we hunt them down without your help. The engagement will be far bloodier, and many Apache will die who might otherwise have been spared. And when it's over, you'll face charges of collaboration with hostile forces." He paused. "Choose wisely, Miss Bennett." Sarah's mind raced through the impossible calculus of the choice before her. Refuse, and she preserved her loyalty to the Apache, but guaranteed a violent confrontation. Help, and she betrayed everything she believed in, but might actually save lives. Could she trust Forrester to keep his word about offering surrender terms? And even if he did, would the Apache accept them? Life on a reservation was a slow death, confinement, dependence, the gradual destruction of everything that made them who they were. But at least it was life. At least the children would grow up, even if in different circumstances. "I need time to think," Sarah said. "You have until morning," Forrester replied. "After that, we continue the pursuit with or without your assistance." That night, confined once again in the supply wagon, Sarah wrestled with the most agonizing decision of her life. Every option felt like a betrayal. Every path led to loss. She thought about Dakota, about his face when she had told him she would never leave him. What would he think when he learned, if he learned, that she had been the one to guide the cavalry to their location? Would he understand she was trying to save lives, or would he see only treachery? She thought about the children she had told stories to, about Nasha, who had taught her to survive, about the women who had finally accepted her as one of their own. What right did she have to make decisions that would determine their fate? And yet, what choice did she have? Forrester would find them eventually, regardless of whether she helped. The scouts were good, and the Apache trail was impossible to completely conceal when moving an entire camp. Her participation might be the difference between negotiated surrender and wholesale slaughter, unless there was another option. Unless she could find a way to warn the Apache without overtly betraying Forrester. Unless she could create an opportunity for them to escape or prepare defenses, or... The plan came to her in the dead of night. Fragile and desperate, but possible. The next morning, she told Forrester she would help him. The captain smiled with satisfaction. "A wise choice, Miss Bennet. You're doing the right thing." Sarah said nothing. She had moved beyond concepts of right and wrong into a realm of pure survival mathematics. For the next 2 days, she rode at the front of the cavalry column, ostensibly helping to track the Apache trail. In reality, she was studying the terrain, the soldiers' habits, their security protocols. She was looking for her opportunity. It came on the evening of the second day. The cavalry made camp in a box canyon that offered good defensive positions but only one entrance. Forrester was confident. The Apache trail was clear now, leading directly north, and they were gaining ground. By his calculations, they would overtake the fleeing band within another day. Sarah asked permission to bathe in the small stream that ran through the canyon. After some debate, Forrester agreed, assigning 2 soldiers to guard her at a discreet distance. Sarah made her way upstream to where a bend in the creek and a cluster of cottonwood trees provided minimal privacy. The guards positioned themselves where they could see the area, but not the details of her bathing. It was the courtesy afforded to a white woman, even one suspected of collaboration. It was also her opportunity. Sarah had been Apache long enough to understand the land in ways the soldiers never would. She had noticed what they had not, that the canyon wall behind the cottonwoods, while appearing sheer, actually concealed a narrow chimney formation that a determined climber could ascend. She had one chance. If she failed, if the guards heard her or saw her, she would be shot as an escaping prisoner. But if she succeeded, Sarah removed her boots and tied them around her neck. She waited until the guards were engaged in quiet conversation, their attention momentarily diverted. Then she began to climb. The ascent was terrifying. The rock was loose in places, her handholds precarious, and every sound seemed magnified in the quiet evening air. Her heart hammered so loudly she was certain it would give her away. But years of working with hides and carrying water had given her strong hands and arms, and Dakota's hunting lessons had taught her how to move silently and efficiently. She climbed with desperate determination, driven by love and fear in equal measure. When she finally pulled herself over the canyon rim, her hands were bleeding and her muscles trembling with exhaustion. But she was free. Sarah didn't pause to celebrate. She ran. She ran through the gathering darkness, ran with all the endurance those long months of Apache life had given her. She ran toward the north, toward the people who thought she had abandoned them, toward the man who might never forgive her for disappearing. She ran to save everyone she loved from a fate they didn't yet know was coming. The night swallowed her, and behind her in the canyon she heard the first shouts of alarm as the guards discovered their prisoner was gone. But by then, Sarah was a mile away and moving fast, and she knew these desert trails in ways the cavalry never would. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs felt like they would collapse. Then she ran more. Dawn found her still moving, delirious with exhaustion, but driven by desperate purpose. She had to reach the Apache before Forrester did. She had to warn them, had to make them understand that surrender was their only option now, that pride and defiance would only lead to death. Most of all, she had to see Dakota again. Had to explain, had to make him understand why she had vanished, what she'd been trying to do. The thought that he might hate her, might think she had chosen her white heritage over him, was almost more than she could bear. By mid-morning, Sarah's strength was failing. Her mouth was cotton dry, her vision swimming. She had no water, no food, and the desert sun was merciless. But she pushed forward, following the trail signs she recognized from her months. With the Apache, the subtle markers that would be invisible to white eyes, but clear as written directions. To anyone who knew how to read them, when she finally collapsed, face first in the red dirt, she didn't know if she would have the strength to rise again. She was drifting in and out of consciousness when she heard voices speaking Apache. Strong hands lifted her and water touched her cracked lips. Sarah? Sarah, can you hear me? She forced her eyes open to see Dakota's face above her, creased with worry and disbelief, and something that might have been joy. Behind him, a dozen warriors stood with weapons ready, clearly having expected a cavalry ambush rather than finding a half-dead woman. Dakota, she whispered. Cavalry, coming, big force, tomorrow, maybe sooner. His arms tightened around her. Rest now. You're safe. No. Sarah struggled to sit up despite her body's protests. Not safe. None of us are safe. Forrester, he has 60 soldiers, artillery. He's hunting us. I tried to warn you, tried to stop him. The words tumbled out in a desperate rush. Apache and English mixing together as she tried to explain everything at once. Slowly, Dakota soothed, pressing his water skin to her lips again. Start from the beginning. Tell me everything, so Sarah did. She told him about trying to negotiate with Forrester, about being captured and imprisoned, about the impossible choice she had been given. She told him about her escape and her desperate run through the night. And she told him the hardest truth of all, that the cavalry was close, that they were coming with overwhelming force, and that fighting them would be suicide. When she finished, Dakota was silent for a long moment. Then he pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. I thought you had left me, he admitted quietly. When you disappeared, some said you had gone back to your people, that you had finally chosen white over Apache. I told them they were wrong, but part of me, his voice cracked, part of me wondered if you had realized you couldn't truly be one of us. I am one of you, Sarah said fiercely. I chose you, Dakota. I will always choose you. That's why I went to Forrester. I thought I could make him understand, could prevent bloodshed. I was wrong. But I was trying to save us, I know, Dakota said. And you did save us. Your warning gives us time to prepare, to make our own choices, instead of being caught by surprise. They made their way back to the main camp, where Sarah's sudden reappearance caused both joy and confusion. The chief listened gravely to her report about the cavalry's size and intentions, his weathered face growing more troubled with each detail. 60 soldiers with artillery, he said when she finished, against 30 warriors and a camp full of women and children. We cannot fight such a force and hope to survive. Then we must run, Delgado argued. Split up, scatter in different directions. They cannot chase everyone, and what kind of life is that? An older warrior countered. Separated from family, always running, never safe? That is no life at all. Better than reservation life, Delgado shot back. Better than slow death in confinement. The debate raged as Sarah sat beside Dakota, her exhaustion threatening to pull her under. She had done everything she could. She had risked everything, betrayed Forrester's trust, nearly died in the desert. And still it might not be enough. The cavalry was coming, and no choice the Apache made would lead to a good outcome. Finally, the chief raised his hand for silence. We cannot win this fight, but we may be able to survive it. Sarah, you know this, Forrester. If we send you to negotiate, will he listen? Sarah thought about the cold calculation in Forrester's eyes, his absolute conviction that the Apache needed to be civilized by force. I don't know, she admitted. He sees me as a victim who needs rescuing. He doesn't accept that I chose this life, then we must make him accept it, Dakota said. We send you not as a captive begging for mercy, but as a translator representing the band. We make it clear that you speak for us by choice, that you are one of us by marriage and by commitment, and if he still won't listen, Sarah asked. Dakota's expression was grim. Then we fight, and at least we die with honor, the council agreed to the plan. At dawn, Sarah would return to the cavalry column under a flag of truce, not as an escaped prisoner, but as an official representative of the Apache band. She would carry terms for peaceful surrender to a reservation, with conditions that would preserve as much dignity and cultural identity as possible. It was a desperate gambit that would likely fail, but it was also their only chance. That night, lying in Takoda's arms for what might be the last time, Sarah allowed herself to imagine different outcomes. A life where she and Takoda could grow old together. Children who might inherit the best of both cultures. Peace between Apache and white settlers, but she was too honest with herself to truly believe those dreams. The world was changing too fast, and forces larger than individual love or courage were sweeping everything before them. The best they could hope for was survival, and even that was far from certain. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Takoda said softly, "and know that you have given me more happiness than I thought possible after losing my first family. You brought me back to life, Sarah. That is a gift beyond measure." "Don't talk as if we're saying goodbye," Sarah whispered, even though they both knew they might be. "We're going to survive this. We have to. We will survive," Takoda agreed. "Perhaps not in the way we want. Perhaps not together in the life we imagined. But the love we share, that will survive no matter what Forrester or the army or anyone else does. Love is stronger than any weapon they can bring against us." Sarah held him tighter, wanting to believe, needing to believe that love could somehow be enough. But dawn was coming, and with it, the reckoning neither of them could avoid. Sarah rode toward the cavalry column at dawn, a white cloth tied to a long stick held high above her head. Beside her rode Takoda and 2 elder warriors, all unarmed, as custom demanded under a flag of truce. Behind them, hidden in the rocks and ravines, the rest of the band waited with weapons ready, prepared for either negotiation or battle. Captain Forrester's scouts spotted them when they were still half a mile out. By the time Sarah's small party reached the cavalry position, 60 soldiers stood in formation with rifles at the ready, and Forrester waited on horseback with an expression that promised nothing good. "Miss Bennet," he said coldly as she approached, "I'm disappointed. I gave you my trust, and you repaid me with escape and, I assume, betrayal of everything I told you about our movements. I repaid you with honesty." "Captain," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "I told you from the beginning that these people are my family. I couldn't let you slaughter them without at least trying to prevent it." "Slaughter?" Forrester's eyebrows rose. "Is that what you think this is? We're here to bring hostile Indians to justice and relocate survivors to the reservation where they can be properly civilized. That's hardly slaughter. It's the advancement of progress." "It's the destruction of a people and their way of life," Sarah shot back. "But I'm not here to debate philosophy. I'm here as a translator and representative of this Apache band to discuss terms of peaceful surrender." Forrester's eyes flickered to Takoda, taking in his proud bearing and the way he sat his horse with casual mastery. "This is your husband, I presume, the savage you claim to have married?" "His name is Takoda," Sarah said firmly. "He is a warrior of honor, and yes, he is my husband. We were married in an Apache ceremony witnessed by the entire band. Our marriage is as real and binding as any performed in a Christian church." Several soldiers muttered at this declaration, their disgust evident. But Forrester silenced them with a raised hand, his attention focused entirely on Sarah. "Let me be very clear about something, Miss Bennet," he said. "You may believe yourself married to this man, but in the eyes of the law, any such ceremony is invalid. You are a white woman who was taken captive by hostile forces. Nothing that happened during your captivity, including any forced or coerced participation in their rituals, has any legal standing whatsoever." "I was not forced or coerced," Sarah said, her voice rising with anger. "I chose. A woman subjected to prolonged captivity and isolation cannot give meaningful consent," Forrester interrupted. "This is an established legal and medical fact. Whatever you think you feel for this man is the result of psychological trauma, nothing more." Sarah felt Takoda tense beside her, though his face remained impassive. She knew he understood enough English to follow the conversation, and she knew how much Forrester's dismissal must wound him. "Captain Forrester," she said, forcing herself to speak calmly. "We can argue about my choices and motivations all day, but that's not why we're here. The Apache band is willing to negotiate peaceful surrender to a reservation on the following conditions." "There will be no conditions," Forrester interrupted. "There will be unconditional surrender, immediate relocation to the reservation at Fort Sumner, and compliance with all Army directives regarding their future conduct." Fort Sumner. Sarah's blood ran cold. She had heard stories about Fort Sumner, the terrible conditions, the disease, the starvation rations. That's over 200 miles away. The journey alone would kill half the children and elders. Then they should have considered that before killing American soldiers. Forrester replied without emotion. Sarah turned to Dakota and quickly translated Forrester's terms in Apache. She watched his face harden as he understood what was being demanded. "This is not negotiation," Dakota said quietly in Apache. "This is surrender without honor. This is the slow death we feared worse than battle. But it's still life," Sarah replied in the same language. "Your children will live to see another day. Isn't that worth any price?" Dakota looked at her with eyes full of pain and love. "Some prices are too high, even for life. I will not condemn my children to die slowly in a cage when they could die free under open sky." Sarah's heart broke as she realized what he was saying. She turned back to Forrester, making one final desperate attempt. "Captain, please. These are not mindless savages. They're people with families, with culture, with dignity. Fort Sumner is a death sentence disguised as mercy. Let them surrender to a closer reservation, one where they might actually survive. Let them keep some small measure of their way of life. Their way of life is incompatible with American progress," Forrester said flatly. "It must be dismantled for their own good and for the safety of settlers in this territory. Those are my terms. Accept them or face the consequences." Before Sarah could respond, a commotion erupted from the rear of the cavalry formation. A wagon was approaching rapidly, accompanied by a small escort of soldiers who had clearly ridden hard to catch up with the main force. An older officer dismounted and strode quickly to Forrester, handing him a sealed document. "Orders from Fort Union, sir. Just arrived this morning." Forrester broke the seal and read quickly, his expression shifting from confidence to surprise to something that might have been frustration. When he finished, he looked up at Sarah and Dakota with an unreadable expression. "It seems," he said slowly, "that circumstances have changed. I have orders from Colonel Morrison at Fort Union to exercise restraint in dealing with Apache bands in this region. There have been—" He paused, clearly unhappy with what he was about to say. "Diplomatic overtures from Apache leaders in other territories. The Army is exploring the possibility of negotiated peace treaties rather than continued military action." Sarah felt a flicker of hope. "Does that mean—" "It means," Forrester continued, "that I am authorized to offer alternative terms. Surrender to the reservation at White Mountain instead of Fort Sumner. It's only 40 miles from here, and conditions are reportedly better. The band would remain intact, families together, and would be allowed to maintain some cultural practices as long as they comply with reservation rules and commit to permanent peace." Sarah quickly translated for Dakota. She watched his face as he absorbed the unexpected reprieve, saw the calculations running behind his eyes as he weighed survival against surrender. "Life against freedom, White Mountain Reservation," Dakota said in Apache. "I know this place. It is not ideal, but it is not death. We could survive there. Our children could grow up there. It's still a cage," one of the elder warriors said. "Still the end of our way of life. But it is life," Dakota replied, echoing Sarah's earlier words. "And where there is life, there is hope. Perhaps our children will find a way to be both Apache and something new. Perhaps they will build bridges between worlds, as Sarah has done." The elders conferred quietly in Apache, while Forrester waited with poorly concealed impatience. Finally, they reached consensus. "We accept White Mountain," Dakota announced in careful English, clearly wanting Forrester to understand without translation. "We surrender. We go to a reservation. We keep the peace. In exchange," Sarah added quickly, "the band remains together. No separation of families. And I go with them as Dakota's wife, Miss Bennett, Forrester said, his voice carrying a warning. You are a white woman. You belong with your own people, not on an Indian reservation. I belong with my husband, Sarah replied firmly. And if you try to separate us, you'll find that your peace treaty won't last a single day. The Apache will fight if you tear apart their families, and that includes my family. Forrester and Sarah locked eyes in a battle of wills. Around them, 60 soldiers and 4 Apache waited to see who would break first. Finally, Forrester looked away. Very well. If you insist on condemning yourself to that life, I won't stop you. But understand this. Once you go to that reservation, you give up any claim to the protection and benefits of white society. You will be treated as Apache, with all the limitations and restrictions that entails. I understand perfectly, Sarah said, and I accept those terms gladly. The formal surrender was conducted with military precision. The Apache band emerged from their positions and submitted to being counted and recorded. Women, children, elders, and warriors all passed before army clerks who noted names, ages, and family relationships in neat columns that would define their future existence. Sarah stood beside Dakota throughout the process, her hand in his, presenting a united front that left no doubt about where her loyalties lay. She saw the disgust on some soldiers' faces, the pity on others, and the cold calculation on Forrester's, but she didn't care. She had made her choice, and she would live with it. As the sun set on that momentous day, the Apache band began the 40-mile journey to White Mountain Reservation under cavalry escort. They traveled slowly to accommodate the children and elders, and at night they camped under guard, but were otherwise left largely alone. On the second night of the journey, as they sat by a small fire with Dakota's arm around her shoulders, Sarah allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. They had survived. Against all odds, against the machinery of military conquest and manifest destiny, they had found a path that preserved life even if it sacrificed freedom. It wasn't the ending she had dreamed of during those early days of courtship and newly discovered love. But it was an ending she could live with. No regrets? Dakota asked softly. Sarah looked around at the camp, at Nash attending the fire, at children sleeping peacefully despite tomorrow's uncertainty, at warriors who had laid down arms, but not dignity. She thought about the life she had lived with these people, the person she had become, the love she had found. No regrets, she confirmed. Whatever comes next, we face it together, and that, in the end, was all that truly mattered. The sound of cavalry bugles that had awakened Sarah at the beginning of our story now took on its full, devastating meaning. She stood at the entrance of her wickiup on the White Mountain Reservation, watching as a column of Union soldiers approached through the morning mist. Beside her, Dakota placed a protective hand on her shoulder. "They're not here for us," he said quietly. "Look, that's Lieutenant Crawford, the one who treats us fairly." Sarah relaxed slightly as she recognized the young officer who had replaced the harsh commander initially assigned to White Mountain. Crawford had proven to be a rare thing, a military man who actually listened and tried to implement humane policies. Crawford dismounted and approached with genuine respect. "Mrs. Dakota, I apologize for the early hour. I have news from the territorial capital that I couldn't wait. What he told them changed everything." The territorial governor, impressed by reports of the peaceful conditions at White Mountain compared to other reservations, wanted to create a new position, an official liaison between Apache communities and the government. Someone who could translate not just language but culture, who could advocate for fair treatment while helping Apache peoples navigate the complex world of American bureaucracy. They wanted Sarah. The governor believes your unique perspective, understanding both worlds intimately, makes you invaluable, Crawford explained. You'd have the authority to inspect reservations, report abuses directly to the capital, and recommend policy changes. Real power to create real change. Sarah looked at Dakota, whose expression was unreadable. They had built a quiet life here, raising their 2 young children, a daughter of 3 and a son barely walking. Accepting this position would mean travel, danger, and thrusting herself back into the conflict between 2 worlds. "I need time to consider this," Sarah said. But that night, as she and Dakota talked long into the darkness, they both knew what her answer would be. Sarah had never been able to ignore injustice, and now she had the chance to fight it with real authority. "You were meant for this," Dakota said simply. "From the moment you chose to stay with us, you've been building bridges. Now you can build them on a scale that might actually save lives." Within a month, Sarah began her new work. What she discovered in her travels horrified her. Reservations where corrupt agents sold food meant for starving families. Children forcibly taken from parents and sent to distant schools, designed to kill the Indian, save the man. Traditional ceremonies banned, languages forbidden, dignity systematically stripped away. But Sarah documented everything. She wrote reports that landed on the governor's desk with the weight of undeniable truth. She testified before territorial committees with a passion that came from lived experience. She became, quite simply, a force that could not be ignored. The work was exhausting and often heartbreaking. Sarah saw communities crushed under policies designed to erase their existence. But she also saw resilience. Apache families finding ways to preserve their culture in secret, to pass down stories and traditions despite every obstacle. And slowly, painfully, her advocacy began to create change. A particularly brutal reservation administrator was removed after Sarah's damning report. Food rations were increased at 3 locations where she documented near-starvation conditions. Permission was granted for certain ceremonial practices that had been banned. Small victories, but they mattered. Years passed in this work. Sarah's children grew up watching their mother fight for justice, learning from her example that one person with courage and conviction could make a difference. Her daughter Ayana became a teacher who created curricula honoring Apache history. Her son David studied law to better understand the systems his mother was fighting to change. When Sarah was 45, something unexpected happened. She received a letter from Colonel Edmund Forrester, retired now and living in Santa Fe. He requested a meeting. Sarah's first instinct was to refuse. This was the man who had dismissed her choices, who had tried to tear her from everything she loved, who represented all the military arrogance that had devastated Apache peoples. But curiosity won out, and she agreed to meet him in a neutral location. The man who sat across from her in that Santa Fe cafe bore little resemblance to the rigid captain she remembered. Age had softened him, and his eyes carried a weight of regret. "Mrs. Dakota," he began formally, "I've followed your work with great interest. Your advocacy has been remarkable." "Thank you," Sarah said cautiously. Forrester took a deep breath. "I owe you an apology. 20 years ago, I was so certain of my righteousness that I couldn't see the humanity in front of me. You told me you had chosen your life with the Apache, that your love for Dakota was real. I dismissed it as a delusion." He met her eyes directly. "I was wrong. About you, about the Apache, about what civilization truly means. Your life, the choice you made, and the work you've done since has taught me more than a lifetime of military service ever did." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. This was an apology she never expected to receive. "If you truly mean that," she said quietly, "then use your influence to help. Your voice as a respected former officer could open doors. Mine cannot." Forrester nodded slowly. "I've already begun. That's why I wanted to meet, to coordinate our efforts." What followed was an unlikely alliance. Forrester's military credentials gave him access to audiences Sarah couldn't reach, while her first-hand knowledge gave his advocacy credibility it wouldn't otherwise have. Together, they became an unexpectedly powerful force for reform. 3 years later, the territorial legislature passed landmark legislation, establishing oversight committees for reservation administration and protecting certain Apache cultural practices. It wasn't everything Sarah had fought for, but it was significant progress. On the evening the law was signed, Sarah stood with Dakota overlooking the reservation that had been their home for 18 years. Their children were grown now, building their own lives that bridged both worlds. Around them, the community continued its daily routines, proof that Apache people had survived despite every attempt to destroy them. Do you ever regret it? Dakota asked the question he asked periodically over the years, not from doubt, but from genuine curiosity about her experience. Sarah thought about the life she might have lived if she had accepted the cavalry's rescue at 30. She could have returned to white society, remarried within her race, lived in conventional comfort and safety. Never, she said firmly. Every hardship we've faced was worth it for the life we built together. You gave me something I never had in my white life. Freedom to be fully myself, to think my own thoughts, to pursue my own purpose. That gift is beyond price. Dakota pulled her close. You gave me something equally precious. After I lost my first wife and son, I thought I would never feel joy again. You brought me back to life. You showed me that love could transcend any barrier if both people were brave enough. As darkness fell over the reservation, they stood together as they had for nearly 3 decades. Two people who had defied every expectation, who had built something beautiful from the ruins of cultural collision, who had proven that love and courage could create bridges across seemingly impossible divides. Sarah continued her advocacy work for another 15 years, training younger Apache women to carry on the fight for justice and dignity. When she finally died at 63, her body worn out from decades of tireless travel and work, she was mourned by both Apache and white communities. At her funeral, Dakota spoke in both Apache and English, his voice steady despite his grief. My wife was captured as a girl and rescued as a woman, but she spent the rest of her life teaching the world what those words truly meant. She was never a captive. She was someone who chose her own path with full knowledge and courage. And she was never rescued from us. She fought to come home to where she belonged. He paused, looking out at the gathered crowd that included their children and grandchildren, Apache elders and white reformers, people whose lives Sarah had touched through her fierce advocacy. She built bridges between worlds, Dakota continued, not by denying either culture but by honoring both. She showed us that identity is about choice, not blood, that love can transcend any barrier, that one person with courage and conviction can change the world. Sarah's legacy lived on in the policies she had helped create, in the communities she had fought for, in her children who continued her work, and in the hearts of everyone who heard her remarkable story. The girl who had been captured at 16 and rescued at 30 had spent the rest of her life proving that freedom isn't about where you come from. It's about having the courage to choose where you belong. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.